We're here at Le Bourget at COP21 right outside Paris, and we're here with Professor Niklas Hohne. Did I pronounce that?
Very good. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, good. And this is amazing. And why it's amazing is because I'm sitting here now with probably maybe the world's expert, but certainly one of the preeminent scientists, really expert in the matter of the gap. And the gap we're speaking of is the gap between where we're predictably headed in terms of our carbon emissions and the temperature increase, and what's required to keep us within the safety zone of what has been generally accepted will be to a maximum of a 2 degree Celsius increase above pre-industrial temperature. And Niklas is the lead author of the UNEP emissions gap report from 2010 to 2015, which I very much appreciate because as someone that got into this relatively late a couple years ago, the only thing I was interested in is what's the gap? How much time do we have? What's it going to take to bridge that? What's predictable? And your report really became my main resource in terms of getting that information. So I really, really appreciate it. You also created the Climate Action Tracker that tracks commitments and actions of countries on climate change. And you recently became a professor, and you're what's the university?
Wageningen in the Netherlands.
Ah, beautiful, beautiful. Okay, good. So thank you very much for having this conversation with us, because I see it as really, a way for people, regardless of how much they know about climate change, to actually get a sense of what the gap is. And for people like me that aren't scientists, that just kind of lay people, and so that's the conversation we're here to have.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. So how I thought we kind of lay it out is just kind of, first of all, to just kind of go through how you track it, what the metrics are. So for example, one of the things is the carbon budget. And so the CO2 budget, and the way I see it is it's kind of like if you have a balloon, there's as much air that you can put into the balloon before the balloon pops. And in that same way, there is an amount of the total amount of carbon that we can put into the atmosphere. And if we go beyond that kind of allocated total amount, then we've gone beyond the safety zone. Is that accurate?
That's exactly the case. I mean, the major greenhouse gas CO2 stays in the atmosphere for a very long time. So if we emit it today, it will have its effect for a very long period.
Yes.
So that basically means we have a finite amount of CO2 that we can emit. Yes. That corresponds to a temperature level that we reach in the end.
Yes.
So the more CO2 we emit over a long period of time, the higher the temperature increase will be.
Yes.
And the less we emit over this century, the lower the temperature increase will be. So people call it a budget.
Uh-huh.
So you have a full budget over the course of the full century.
Yes. Okay, good. And then the other metric or the measurement is just the annual emissions. So the amount of gigatons that we emit annually, which also is directly correlated to the amount that's the total amount, but also what's in the report is a lot of statistics in terms of, well, what's the annual emittance? Is it going down? Is it increasing? Also, at what point will it peak? Will the increase peak and then begin to go down? So that's also kind of a critical way of having people get a sense of where we are in the gap, right?
Exactly. So if you have that budget, you can spend that budget over the course of the full century.
Yes.
And it basically means if you spend more today, you have less to spend afterwards.
Yes.
And it's even in that way that you can say if you overspend today, you could theoretically even make up for that later by taking CO2 out of the atmosphere. So translating this budget to yearly and annual emissions, there's a bit of freedom. You can do more today and you have to do less afterwards.
Yes.
Or you do less now, but then you have to catch up. The very important thing about this is it's a finite budget. It's at the end at one point.
Yes.
So that always means in all situations you have to reduce emissions to zero because the budget will be depleted.
Yes.
So for any temperature increase that you would like to have, you have to reduce emissions to zero. The earlier you do that, and the lower the budget was until then, the lower will be the temperature increase. But it's very clear from the climate system perspective that you need to reach zero emissions if you want to stabilize the climate.
Okay, good. Now, to get to the budget, and then this is from the report. It says, considering a theoretical situation in carbon dioxide is the only anthropomorphic greenhouse gas, the IPCC estimated a maximum total carbon budget of 3,670 gigatons of carbon dioxide for a likely chance of staying within the 2 degrees Celsius limit. However, since emissions began growing rapidly in the late 19th century, we've already emitted about 1,900 gigatons of carbon dioxide. In addition, a variety of other substances have an impact on global warming, also emitted, and further reduced the remaining budget to about 2,900 gigatons. So the total budget, how much room we've got is 2,900 gigatons, kind of the net budget, right?
Exactly.
Okay, good. Leaving less than about 1,000 gigaton carbon dioxide to emit in the future. So we've only got 1,000 gigatons left. Is that
Exactly, 1,000
where we are
gigatons
right now?
for the whole period from now until the end of the century, basically.
okay? And once that gets used up, that's
Then
it.
we will reach, to
Go
the best
beyond-
of our knowledge
yes.
right now, we will reach a temperature that is close to 2 degrees,
Yes.
and with some certainty of being below that.
Okay.
And if we all, the world community has agreed on this goal to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees.
Yes.
And if we're all serious, then that's the budget that we have left.
Yes. Okay. So then, I just want to go back, and this was from the White House report, okay? Because there's a couple things that now that I have you here, I want to kind of reconcile
excellent.
for myself, okay? So they did all kinds of, as you know, different kind of scenarios, likely, most likely, unlikely, what's aggressive, that kind of thing, right? So they said that emission pathways consistent with the likely 66% chance of meeting the 2 degree Celsius target have a peak before 2020, okay? And have emission levels in 2020 of around 44 gigatons. Afterward, global emissions would steeply decline, like that, okay? So that's basically says that we can't go beyond 44 gigatons, is that right?
In the year 2020.
In the year 2020.
The main thing, translating the budget into yearly emissions,
Yes.
is what kind of a pathway you assume. Do you assume more reductions in the year 2020, 2030?
Yes.
Then you have less reductions to be done afterwards, or do you do it the other way around? You allow more emissions in 2020 and 2030, and then you have to catch up with it. So in earlier GAP reports, when we started this 5 years ago, we assumed that action should start immediately,
Yes.
and basically assumed that then emissions in 2020 could be lower. This number of 44 gigatons
44
in
gigatons.
2020.
Yes.
Now we are 5 years later,
Yes.
and 2020 is not far away,
Yes.
and it's very difficult to influence the emissions in 2020 today.
Yes, yes.
There's some freedom, but you can't do much more anymore, and emissions have increased since then significantly.
Yes.
Now the new UNEP GAP report now assumes different types of scenarios that go to a high level in 2020, well above the 44 gigatons
Yes.
that we had before, but then have to decrease quite rapidly afterwards. That's a difference that is made in the analysis that is due to the fact that we have lost a lot of time in the last 5 years.
Yes.
It would have been much easier to reach the required reductions if we would have started earlier.
Yes.
We basically missed a few very, very important years.
Yes. Yeah, it says, and again, this is in this year's report, it says, as an update on the reports, cover range. The range of median estimates is 52 to 54 gigatons, about the same as in the 2013 report. It's 6 to 12% above the 2010 emissions of 49 gigatons and about 7-12% lower than the business as usual level in 2020. So it seems like we've already hit what they said was the limit in kind of what am I thinking wrongly, or is it?
Yeah, what we thought is the limit 5 years ago,
Yes.
when you say you start immediately with reductions, is is the 44 gigatons in 2020.
Yes.
But it's now unlikely that that path will be taken. And we now have to look at other scenarios that increase emissions now and then go down much faster.
Yes.
And that is not an optimal scenario, because that will definitely be more difficult and more expensive.
Yes.
Because we basically overspend today and we need to make up for that later.
Yes.
Just imagine what that means. If we need to make up for it, that basically means we need to retire installations that are built right now, like coal-fired power plants.
Yes.
We need to retire them before the end of their life. If you build a coal-fired power plant, if you build this coal-fired power plant today,
yes,
it will last for 40 years. Yeah, that's the usual lifetime of such a power plant. But we also see that all the trajectories that go in the direction of 2 degrees, they basically say that the electricity sector has to decarbonize and has to reduce its emissions much faster than other sectors. And it basically says that emissions from electricity have to be zero already by 2050. That's in 35 years from today.
yes,
So it basically says that if you build a coal-fired power plant today,
wow,
it will not operate until the end of its life
wow,
if you are serious about the 2-degree target. And that's what I'm saying. So if we do the wrong things today, build coal-fired power plants, it will become very expensive afterwards, shutting these things off before the end of their economic life.
wow. Now, I know there's been some debate, because I've been at the previous conferences in Bonn leading up to this, and they were saying that 2 degrees is the safety limit. And then it got a bit louder. It seemed that, well, 2 degrees probably isn't. Maybe we should bring it down to 1.5 degrees, since I think we're now at approximately 0.9 degrees. Is that right? Increase?
Exactly.
Yeah. And however, I've also heard that, as you said at the beginning, with the carbon that's already in the atmosphere that stays there for hundreds of years, even if we stopped emissions today to zero, we would predictably increase to 1.5 degrees. Is that accurate? So that essentially the 1.5 degree limit is gone.
Yeah, well, the climate system works in a way that, as I said, CO2 stays in the atmosphere for very long.
Yes.
So if we emit today,
Yes.
we see the full temperature effect of the CO2 in the atmosphere only in the future. So as you said, if we stop emitting completely today, temperature would still rise and then stabilize at a certain level. And that level, there's a question on how high that is. I think it's still below 1.5 degrees, but the budget available to then still stay below 1.5 is very, very small, and we have to reduce emissions drastically, much faster than for 2 degrees. And I think reaching 1.5 degrees, which is very important for many countries actually, will be a big, big challenge. The hope is that for a limited period of time, maybe that limit is breached, and then the temperature would slowly decline again to 1.5. But whether that's really possible from the climate system, there's a bit of an uncertainty there.
Okay. Now, I know this is going to be is maybe not even answerable. I don't know, kind of in the simplistic way that I'm going to be asking the question. But for the person, out there that just is kind of wondering, okay, well, what has to happen by when? Or what series of things or results have to be produced by when, so that we have at least a running chance, a good shot at staying within the 2 degree limit? Is it because, again, I hear things, but I don't know, how to put it in perspective of the gap. So for example, when I heard the representative from China give the opening remark and say that, that there is an accomplishment and that they would be, peaking their emissions by 2030 and then reducing. Well, I think, okay, well, in terms of the gap, is that far beyond what's acceptable? Is that keep us within the 2 degrees? Is it not? So is there any kind of, that you could speak to kind of the layman in terms of what is it? What is left? Is 2 degrees even possible? It is possible, but we have to buy this, and we'll be able to tell by 2020 if it's still possible, or kind of what is the break point, if there is any such thing like that.
I think the easiest way to look at it is in the long term. and it's a finite budget, and it's depleted at a certain point, and that means that emissions have to go to zero.
Yes.
And that's, I think, understandable for everybody. But that means a complete transformation of our energy system. Right now, our energy system is based on fossil fuels, and we need to completely flip that by, first of all, using less energy, being more energy efficient, and second, by supplying that leftover energy with carbon-free sources, in particular renewable energy. And that's basically what needs to happen.
Right.
And the question is when it happens and where it happens. There's some freedom because it's a budget, so
Right.
if you do more here, you can do less there.
Right.
So there's the freedom, but the end point is the same, it's zero.
Yes.
And to put a few numbers in there, it would work, for example, if we would make the whole electricity system completely carbon-free by 2050, by the middle of the century. So no more CO2 emissions from the global electricity system. That means no coal, no gas, well, a little bit gas maybe to balance the renewables, but actually in essence it's zero emissions from the electricity system already by 2050. It would also work at the same time. We would have to build very, very efficient houses, for example. Right now houses are using a lot of energy for heating and cooling, but we already now have technologies available to make them very, very energy efficient, basically zero energy houses. We can build them today, and they are built. And we would need to drastically scale up those zero energy houses. Basically all new houses would have to be built zero energy from now on. And transport, a transition towards 100% renewables would mean a transition towards a lot of electricity and away from liquid fuels. So we would go away from liquid fuels in transport, gasoline, towards electric transport. So that's a transition that's necessary, and we would basically by 2050 all drive electric cars, or even better, use public transport. So those are the kinds of things that need to happen.
And does that all translate into, because I know there's been talk about what's included in the text in terms of decarbonization and any kind of hard targets, and there was at least floated full decarbonization by 2050. So is that all part of what that would be? Are you essentially saying that same thing?
Yeah, you need to translate this little freedom you have with the budget into something that the international community can agree to. And they can't agree to very much details. They have to have a high-level line. And the way people are trying to frame that high-level line is to say decarbonization, so basically transforming the energy system to be carbon-free. And you call it decarbonization. And then in the best event, you would add a date when that has to happen globally. And some people say full decarbonization by 2050. Some others say in the second half of the century, or some say by the end of the century. That's a bit of the negotiation space. But I would hope that here in Paris they can agree on some kind of language like that, because all the citizens, the investors, the companies, the governments, they understand better that emissions have to go zero than that they have to be 2-degree compatible. 2-degree compatible doesn't tell anything what it is. You have to explain it in a lot of sentences. But saying you have to go to zero emissions, that's much easier. And then actually it doesn't matter anymore when it is. Because then it's obvious if you first increase emissions and then decrease emissions, that's probably not an optimal pathway.
Right. And then what about negative emissions? So the conversation now, more of a conversation at least that I've heard in terms of that simply stopping the rate of, or slowing the rate of emissions or stopping emissions is insufficient, that we actually have to, with the new technologies, actually decarbonize what's already there.
I think the most important element here is that we first have to use all of the options to reduce emissions today. and they are available. So there's a lot we can do to use less energy. There's a lot we can do to implement more renewable energy. It's all there, and it's not that expensive. In many cases, it's cheaper than the alternative. So that's the most important thing. Now, as you said, some people say we may not be fast enough, which if you look at it realistically, that may indeed be the case. Then, since the budget is finite, if you overspend in the beginning, you have to make up for it later. And if you really overspend your budget, you have to go into negative at the end of the century. And that is a very risky strategy, actually. The only way how to take CO2 out of the atmosphere right now is using biomass, so growing trees. And the trees will take CO2 out of the atmosphere when they grow. And when you then burn the trees, you scrap the CO2 and bury it in the ground. And there's two problems with that. One is, do we have enough biomass to do this with? Because biomass usually competes with food production and other things, other uses of the landscape. That's very difficult. And the second one is, do we have the technology to take the CO2 out and bury it in the ground, and will it stay there? There's two major problems that we have with that. And whether that will really materialize in the end, I question it. So banking on having this great technology available in 50 years from now, and saying because we will have it, we can emit more today, that's very dangerous.
So, in the matter of the gap, what do you primarily have your eye on?
We look at whether countries, what they propose here as their national contribution towards the international climate treaty, all countries are asked to provide their proposals of what they are offering to do. And we're comparing that to what would be necessary to keep this 2-degree limit.
Yes.
And to take China as an example, China said we would peak emissions by 2030. And if you look at the carbon budget and the different scenarios that are out there, we would say it's a bit too late.
Yes.
China would have to peak hopefully by 2020. China is the largest emitting country, and so they have big influence on the total budget, and they would basically need to peak around 2020 to be compatible with all the scenarios that we see. So we would say China either by itself or needs to be helped to do a bit more. That applies equally to the US.
Yes.
The US has proposed to reduce its emissions by 26 to 28% by the year 2025,
yes,
compared to 2005. That's already a downward slope, and it's much better than what the US did before.
Yep.
But again, it's not sufficient to what the US really should do to be compatible with 2 degrees. So also the US has to do more.
Yes. So is there anywhere, because this is great, I mean, is there anywhere that is going to be available to us? You know, that this is what China pledged, and it's definitely progress, and it's definitely a step in the right direction, as everyone said. This is not about, Paris is not the end, it's the beginning. It's a framework, it's a real shift in terms of countries working together, and amazing. However, this has got to be pulled back from 2030 to 2020, right? Is there anywhere that kind of information is going to be available, where there will be a comparison of the INDC against the 2-degree safety limit, and how far it needs to be pulled back or ratcheted up as they're talking about now? Is there any place that's going to be available that those kind of comparisons are going to be made country by country?
Yeah, the international negotiations, the countries that are participating, they're a bit cautious about other countries judging on their ambition level. Yeah, countries are sovereign nations, and one should not judge on the other. That's why the official process, the official process has done, they have simply put all of these proposals together and calculated a global sum, and found that the global sum is higher than what's necessary.
Yes.
They do not go into country detail. But there are research organizations outside of the official process which do that. And one of them is the Climate Action Tracker that we are operating with in partnership with others. And there we look at each individual country and say whether it is in line with what would be a fair contribution towards meeting the 2-degree goal. So we do that for the 30 largest emitters.
So one thing that the citizen could do is go to that report and then support their government, impact their whatever they can in terms of impacting their government to ratchet up, more aggressive, that kind of INDC, right?
Exactly. So we have a website which is called climateactiontracker.org, and there you see pages for each individual country, and we rate them in a traffic light system, very simplified, but very effective, I think. So we have a red light for insufficient, where they're clearly, where their proposal is less ambitious than any kind of interpretation of what could be a fair contribution. Then we have a medium, yellow, where it's kind of okay, but not if everybody would do what they do, it's still not good enough. And then we have a green one for sufficient, where it's really compatible with 2 degrees. And you can see there which countries are in which category.
Great. And then lastly, from some of the people that I've interviewed, both inside the UNFCCC and outside, have said that you shouldn't expect the government to be the answer for this. You shouldn't expect the United Nations to be the answer for this. That it's going to be the private sector that kind of steps in, that's more used to the kind of aggressive, working on targets, producing results, being innovative, transformational thinking and kind of acting, that's going to step in and bridge the gap. So how do you see that?
I'm actually quite optimistic right now about the developments that we see here in Paris. So we track what countries propose, and we see that if we add it all up, we will get to a temperature increase of 2.7 degrees, which is already half a degree to 1 degree better than what we did earlier prior to this process of these national contributions. So that's already good. The bad news is we are at 2.7, but we're not at 2 yet, so there's still a lot to do.
Well, just so I can be clear, because I heard when I was in Bonn that with all of the aggregate with the INDCs together, that it would be somewhere more of an increase in 3 to 4 degrees, but you're saying 2.7.
There's a different, again, the temperature increase, as we explained earlier, is dependent on the emissions from now until the end of the century.
Yes.
And the national proposals only go until 2030. And so you need to make assumptions about what happens after 2030. Okay. Some countries have made proposals like EU and US that they want to reduce emissions drastically until 2050. That we take into account, but we also assume in this scenario that the countries continue with a similar policy effort after 2030.
I see.
And if you assume that, then you come to a more temperature increase of 2.7. Other groups have made other assumptions after 2030, and they basically say, for example, China's emissions stabilize at that level and do not increase or go down. If you do that, then you come to a higher temperature increase. But all of these analyses are consistent in that what countries have put forward already is an improvement over what we had before.
Okay.
Now, all of these proposals, I think, are conservative estimates. Government are cautious in proposing only something that they are sure that they can deliver.
Yes.
They can probably do more. And having now other actors like businesses, cities, regions, individual sectors coming into play as well, that will help these governments to raise their ambitions as well. You have now at this climate change conference, which is originally about governments, national governments, you now have a lot of involvement from other actors. The businesses are here proposing very good progress and new action. You have cities here, you have regions here, you have the financial sector saying we will not invest anymore in emission-intensive activities. So all of these other actors are now also in the game and very active, and hopefully increase the ambition level of what we see right now if you only look at what governments are proposing here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, I can hear by the construction that they're doing here at the green space that we could be wrapping up, right? So I really so appreciate your time and your expertise and all of your work. And is there anything else that you would want to say, to the citizen out there that's just kind of getting into this, or and it's like, interested in the gap, and are we on track? Are we not on track? What's your what do you want to leave them with?
Yeah, I think if we want to really keep climate change under control and reach this 2-degree limit or 1.5 limit, then we need to do everything we can. Yeah, everything and everywhere. And that's a huge, huge task, and everybody needs to help to do that task.
Yes.
But my hope is that we have all the ingredients to do it. Yeah, we know how to save energy. We know how to implement renewable energy. We have all the tools at hand. We just simply need the political will and the will of the citizens to do it.
Yes.
So the citizens themselves can, one, do it themselves, use less energy and try to live in a way that is climate friendly. And second, they can push their governments, their businesses by buying the right products, their cities, their regions to do more. And if we all pull in that direction, then I think we can all have the benefits from going to a climate-friendly and low-carbon world.
Great. Well, Professor Hohne, thank you very much.
Thank you as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, thank you.